You're listening to ArchaeoEd, a podcast about the ancient civilizations of the Americas. I'm your host, Ed Barnhart. I've been an archaeologist, an explorer, and a seeker of esoteric knowledge all over the Americas for 30 years and counting. This podcast is just me, no guests to help me fill the airtime. Sometimes I'll teach you about the many civilizations of the Americas long before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Other times, I'll tell stories of my adventures in the field. It's just me, freed from the podium and talking like we're just having a beer together. If that sounds good to you, then sit back, relax, and let me tell you a tale. Season 6, Episode 3, How I Mapped Palenque, Part 6. The last episode ended on July 1st, 1999, when the Forestry Department got INA to suspend the mapping project. Naturally, I was pretty upset. And once again, I went to Alfonso Morales for help. By the time I got to his house that Friday, he had already been investigating what really happened. I had screwed up and cut too much, but Alfonso discovered that it was the landowners out in western Palenque behind the complaints against the mapping project. Alfonso's cousin, Ophelia, was married to the head of the Landowners Association, a man named Kay. He and I went and met with Kay that evening, and Kay assured us of his support in getting the project reinstated. The weekend arrived, and I had already planned a fun mini-vacation reward for the team. Now we needed it more than ever. Being that we were all nerds, the plan was to get hotel rooms in Villahermosa, order pizza, and then go to the new Star Wars movie. The Phantom Menace had just come out in Mexico, and we were fired up to see it. To be fair, Kirk was not a nerd and not terribly interested in the movie. But a soft bed, AC, and pizza sounded good to him, so he came along too. We snuck rum in to put into our sodas. Truth be told, I drank more than I should have. Heather Hurst never lets me live it down, but I drunkenly cried with joy at the movie. Now, she'll tell you that I cried when Anakin left his mother, but that's not true. That's just when she looked at me. I cried about how cool the pod race scene was. Still embarrassing, but it was not about his mommy. I cried because the movie was so cool, and probably because I was an emotional wreck about the project getting canceled. My wife won't like that I told you that tale, but I promise to tell you the real story of what happened during the project, unvarnished, and that was part of it. We got back to Palenque refreshed, and I got to work solving our problem. We sent the machete crew to Alfonso's excavations. They still needed a paycheck. The rest of the crew went out to help Heather collect measurements for her reconstruction drawings. No machetes. The administrator of Palenque, Juan Antonio Ferrer, was out of town, so I couldn't yet enlist his help. So for 2 days, I joined Alfonso's team. His crew chief Pedro and I made a map of every tree on Temple 20, all on the sides of its pyramid. Pedro, who was a Celtal Maya from Naranjo, had an amazing knowledge of the local trees. We mapped in over 100 trees, and he knew the species of every single one. Juan Antonio finally came back and said that he had spoken with Alejandro Martinez, the head of INA Consejo in Mexico City. He was going to send a letter to me personally, chastising me and ordering me to cut only sight lines from now on. Then we could get back to work. But the letter took days and days to arrive. I spent 2 days, from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., just sitting in the Palenque admin office waiting for it. By July 12th, I was manic. We were losing time, and we really couldn't afford it. I decided we'd have an adventure, exploration day without machetes. If we stayed in the river, we wouldn't need them. So, in bathing suits and tivas, we started at the base of the Pacote waterfall and scaled it. Then, up on the plateau, we followed it all the way back to the mouth of the Pacote Aqueduct. We were excited to see many buildings flanking the Pacote to the north. No previous map even hinted at them. It was a completely unknown but clearly major part of the city. Finally, the letter from Alejandro Martinez arrived. We got the machete crew back from Alfonso and headed straight out to the Pacote. We machine mapped from the temples uphill all the way down to the aqueduct's exit. In the afternoon, 10 more national park guys came out to order me to only cut lines and lecture me about the forest. I smiled, nodded, and shook everyone's hand twice. Then their leader said we were allowed to continue, and they all left. The power was out in El Panchon when we got home, and it stayed out all night. Nevertheless, we had a party by candlelight that night to celebrate the reinstating of the Palenque mapping project. We were back in business. One tough thing about that week is that I decided to fire Rogelio. Everyone else on the crew was Manuel's relative, and none of them liked Rogelio. He became sullen and wouldn't stop telling me ridiculous lies about them. He kept telling me why I should fire them until I had enough. I looked at him and said, "You know who's fired? You." Now, before you feel too bad for Rogelio, know that I did hire him back for Season 3. I just needed everyone to focus and make up for lost time. The next Monday, we started on the huge building that the local guy had showed me before the project got canceled. As we walked out there, we immediately noticed that 3 trees were chainsawed down and lying across the Pacote. I suspected that it was the landowners trying to frame me, but thank goodness nothing came of it. The building was even bigger than I thought. Its south side, which was the shortest, was 10 meters tall. That's the height of a 3-story building. We measured and drew all around its base, discovering that it was roughly L-shaped. Its basal dimensions were basically 80 by 140 meters. That confirmed it as Palenque's largest building, bigger than the palace. The top was covered in a cornfield milpa, one as big as a football field. Looking off its west side, we could see a homestead on a hill. We ended the day by walking over there. First, we met a pair of little boys. The older one was named Juan Carlos. His little brother said nothing, just stared wide-eyed at us. They led us to their father, named Cristobal. I asked him if he was the landowner, but he said no. They were simply the caretakers. He told me that the owner was named Don Heber. I said, "Wait, you mean the guard working at the ruins, Heber?" He said, "Yes, that's the one." Now things made sense. Heber hated me and tried to get my project canceled during Season 1. He was the one who ratted me out to the national park guys. And he was the owner of the milpa on top of the big building. He was trying to keep it hidden. Later, I learned that he and his brother had also been looting out there. And he's actually still doing it. Just last year, I went out there leading a tour group with some Maya jungle guides. They had no idea that the building even existed. When I showed them, they were shocked. I asked if they knew that it was Don Heber's land, and they said yes. Then I asked them, "Is Don Heber a Maya?" They said no, which I knew that. Then I said, "What's a non-Maya guy doing owning and hiding Palenque's biggest building? Someone should stop him." I know I was starting trouble, and I'm not sorry. I'll keep doing it. Heber is a turd and should be kicked out of Palenque, and I'm not going to stop pushing until he gives the world back that amazing building. Okay, I'll step off my soapbox and I will get to my first commercial break. When I return, we'll talk about the most snake-infested part of Palenque. "2025 is on the horizon, so it's time for my annual Mayan wall calendar. This year marks 17 years I've been producing this calendar. Back in 2007, I inherited it from a nice guy named Jeff Schunard. He had been producing it for 20 years. He said, 'I've done my cartoon, and it's time to hand the baton.' I can't believe I'm approaching the completion of my own cartoon making this calendar. Anyhow, the 2025 Maya calendar looks great. As always, it features the winning photos from our annual photo contest. It's a regular wall calendar, but includes the Maya date for every day in 2025, plus important dates in ancient Maya history. It's available at my website, mayan-calendar.com. If you support ArchaeoEd through Patreon at the Mayanist level, you get one for free. Proceeds go to support Maya Exploration Center. Get yours today and see time in a different way for 2025. That Monday, it was just Kirk and I. We machine mapped the area west of the Pacota Aqueduct and a pool feature that it was connected to. Years later, Kirk would return to excavate that pool, discovering it had stairs leading down in and natural springs welling up from its base. It was like a private, sacred swimming pool. Jim had to go to the immigration office and get his visa renewed. We all hated getting our visas renewed because it was a crappy process. The government office was on the outskirts of town. You had to go out there, fill out the application, and then drive back into town to deposit your fee in Banamex. I don't know exactly why, but the immigration office was not allowed to handle any money. The worst part was that the building was also the jail where they kept people caught sneaking across the border of Guatemala. You could see the cell from the immigration desk, and sometimes it was packed to capacity with people. One time I sat there as a teenage boy yelled, "Please call my mother in El Salvador. No one knows I'm here." I tell you, that was a horrible place. Jim got back the next day and we started machine mapping the big building, which we decided to name Templo Escondido, or the Hidden Temple. It's got a boring alphanumeric name too, but we couldn't help but give it a more romantic name. It took the rest of the week to map it. On top of it had a section that extended off to the north, right to the edge of the cliff, which was about 100 meters tall there. Its view of the plains below stretched all the way to the horizon, a real commanding view of everywhere. On that extended platform was a big 3-meter-tall L-shaped building. It looked like many residential buildings we had found in the forest below, but this one was bigger. One corner had some fresh looting. It wasn't major, but it was disturbing that it was so recent. Just as we were cutting careful lines in front of it to map, we ran into the biggest Nahuiaca that we had ever seen. Almost 3 meters long. Jacobo quickly dispatched it. Kirk immediately skinned it, and we found 14 eggs inside. The next day we tackled the north side. It was scary because the temple plus the cliff equaled over 100 meters in height, all covered by thick acawal. We hoped it had some terraces, but we really couldn't tell yet. We couldn't see anything. As far as we knew, it was just a cliff that dropped straight off. Only being able to cut sight lines meant that we were flying blind to that bigger picture. Kirk was feeling his way out to the edge on the first terrace we found with the rod, and I was scoping him from the machine about 10 feet away. I was on the machine, Jim was with the recording book in between us, and Kirk was on the edge. He tried to plant the rod through the grass, but it went right through. He parted the grass between his feet with the rod and saw nothing but sky. He had bent over the thick grass like a platform hanging off the terrace, and it was a sheer drop below him. Jim called up to me. He said, "Kirk says he's going to die." Looking back, I'm a little appalled at my response, but I said, "Well, then take a picture of him." Jim did, just as Kirk leapt to safety. I still have that photo somewhere. I'll put it in my show notes if I can find it. That weekend, I was excited to add the Escondido to our working map. To my surprise, its base was the same elevation as the plaza surrounding Palenque's palace. That was 1 kilometer away to the east. The elevation between the two varied by 17 meters as it went through river valleys and up over buildings. And the Escondido was on ground level. Palenque's plaza was a massive terrace built up to an arbitrary height. Did its ancient engineers make the palace exactly the same elevation as the Escondido on purpose? I can't say for sure, but I am sure they were capable of it. The next week we went back to the drawing stage. Just after the Pacota Aqueduct, the river turned east and met the Piedras Bolas River at the cliff's edge, making a huge 100-meter wide waterfall. But just before it did, it bisected a flat area with over 100 buildings. At this point, we had less than 3 weeks left in the field season, and we had to get this whole section done. Lucky for us, the section on the south side of the river was open forest, and we made faster than usual progress. We drew in 50 buildings in a single day. We also found a weird thing, a loose grove of lemon trees. Not limes, lemons. Both lemons and limes are from around India and not indigenous to the Americas, but only limes were successfully cultivated by the European colonists. Lemon trees got moldy in the humid climate, but the lime trees, they liked it. Nevertheless, someone at Palenque had managed to do so, based on the large size of the trees, probably decades earlier. It was a fun discovery. We filled our backpacks with lemons and brought them home, making some very passable lemonade. And we named that group Los Limones. We crossed into the section north of the Pacota to find dozens more buildings, a solid patch from the waterfall's base all the way back to the Templo Escondido. The neighborhood's north side was bordered by the steep cliff drop-off. There were also a bunch of barbed wire fences. I learned later that that was Heber's brother's land. There were many small buildings, and then a much larger platform with residential buildings on top, probably another clan leader's residence. That building was extensively looted, 4 different big holes with modern trash strewn all over. The trash was mostly chip bags and plastic water bottles. No local Maya people I knew ate that kind of stuff. They packed corn gruel they called mats and water jugs from home. Whoever did that looting was not a local Maya person. It was on Heber land, so you know who I think did it. That group was also full of snakes. We encountered at least one every single day, none less than 2 meters long. For that reason, we called it Grupo Nahuyaca. The worst episode happened near the Escondido. There was a large L-shaped building with a barbed wire fence following its interior elbow. I climbed down from the top and bent down to duck through the fence. But just as I got 1 foot through, a Nahuyaca slithered through my straddled legs. He moved fast along the fence line away from me. Elias moved quicker, lunging at it with his machete. It was never a good idea to strike that close. Those snakes can spring. Manuel yelled at him to stop, but he deftly put his arm through the fence and flicked his machete with his wrist. He caught it right behind the head and clipped it clean off. The head flipped up in the air and landed at my feet, its mouth still snapping, and it was still looking at me. Then Kirk jumped in and picked up the body. It was still wriggling like crazy, headless, but still trying to get away. That all happened in less than 30 seconds. We stood there catching our breath for a few minutes, but then we just got back to work. That's how the job of mapping Palenque went. Okay, last commercial break, and when I return, we'll wrap up Season 2 of the Palenque mapping project. Join us this coming February for a special tour to the massive ancient Maya city of Calakmul. This is another one of those adventures that virtually no one but Maya Exploration Center leads. The leader for this trip is MEC's newest staff member, amazing archaeologist Zachary Lindsay. Zach has been living in the Yucatan for years, and few know the Maya ruins like he does. The tour begins and ends in Tulum's brand new airport. That makes it easy to add some beach time before or after the tour dates. For those of you living in the north, a little sun and sand for February sounds pretty good, eh? There's another important reason to visit Calakmul sooner than later: the new Maya train. When it's finished, Calakmul and the surrounding region will be Disneyized. 2025 might be your last chance to see it before that happens. Of course, the trip will see much more than Calakmul. Along the way, Zach will guide you through 9 other ruins and teach you about the colonial Maya caste wars. The dates are February 7th through 15th, 2025. To learn more about this tour, log on to mayaexploration.org. Adventure awaits. Again, with our prohibition from clear-cutting, we had a hard time shooting points with the laser theodolite. The Pacocha River was pretty shallow there, so I decided we'd map down its more open path. We'd station the machine along the riverbank and then tromp through the river to the buildings lining it. Our boots were soaked, but we made great progress, all the way to where the river dropped off into the big waterfall. About midway down the river, we found a stone-built box inside the river, connected to its north bank. It was about the size of a refrigerator and made of flat stones on all 6 sides. It was very much like the one we had found in the Motiapa River months earlier. Our best guess was that it was a fishing weir, or perhaps a place where fresh fish were kept, like a fish farm pen. The fact that it was still intact in a riverbed after 1,000 rainy seasons was a testimony to just how expertly it was built. The next day started with us breaking the prism head on a rock. Luckily, it was at the neck, so we glued it back together that night. For the rest of the day, we drew in the Nawiaka group. Of course, we encountered another 2-meter-long Nawiaka. I also stuck my head in another wasp's nest, and the machete crew thought it was hysterical, pointing and laughing at me. With the prism head glued back on, we made short work of the more open lemon group that day. We quit a bit early, and we took time to talk to the machete crew in a way that we normally didn't actually have time to do. I wrote their names and ages in my journal that day. Manuel Cruz Mendez was 17. Jacobo Piñate Gomez was 27. Elias, though he looked like an old man, said that he was 40. He wouldn't tell me his last names, which was weird, but I let it go. Instead, he told me of his observations about male versus female Nawiakas. He said males were darker with black lines around their diamonds. Females were lighter, with no black outlines on their diamonds. I have no idea if that's true. I'm just sharing what he said and what I wrote down in my journal that day. That Friday was the last Friday of Season 2. Jim helped Heather get her final measurements while Kirk and I finished machine mapping the Nawiaka group. We crossed the 1,000 building mark that day. We had now mapped 1,018 structures. I let the machete crew out early because they were headed to Palenque's annual feria in town. That weekend took me by surprise. Moy came to my house and asked me to help him guide a group of politicos at the ruins. I agreed and drove us up to the ruins to meet them Saturday morning. It turned out to be a group of powerful senators who called themselves Grupo Gallego. And with them was the PRI candidate for Mexican president, Francisco Labastida. He was defeated the next year by Vicente Fox, but PRI had won the presidency for 71 years straight at that point. So as far as we knew that day, we were with the future president. Moy and I gave them a great tour, and then they invited us to dinner at Palenque's fanciest restaurant, La Selva. I gave them all copies of my map, and they seemed to really like it. Moy told the men his amazing stories, and I was chatted up by the senators' wives, most of whom spoke perfect English. Archaeology is a very political endeavor in Mexico, and by the end of the night, we had secured their enthusiastic support for both my and Alfonso's projects. Moy and I were a great team. Monday and Tuesday, we machine mapped the massive waterfall and wrapped up all the loose ends. We did one more map test loop to stations on the other side of the Piedras Bolas and got only 3 centimeters of error. Wednesday, Moy and his current girlfriend Izumi, a smart, beautiful woman from Japan, came out to visit the looting we had found. He suggested that we go over to the homestead west of the Escondido and ask them about it. They recognized Don Moises and greeted us warmly. Cristobal's wife served us food, and the kids played music and danced for us as he explained that they had no idea who did the looting. No new info, but man, did Moy get more respect out of these folks than I had initially received on my own. Thursday, August 12th, was the official last day of the 1999 field season. We went out to hide our nails and remove our flagging tape. That night, we had a ruckus dinner party at Don Mucho's. The next day was August 13th, Maya Creation Day. The whole crew and Moises led a big group of friends and neighbors to see the Templo Escondido. That weekend, we cleaned up the house and Chato helped us lock all our stuff in the downstairs office. Kirk took off Saturday morning. I stayed up late drinking with Moises and making plans for the future. We dreamed of doing a reforestation project together and building a scale model of Palenque between our houses. Sadly, neither of those happened, but it was nice to have shared dreams. Sunday morning, Jim and I got into my partially crushed yellow station wagon and drove to the town of San Andreas Tuxtla in the Tuxtla Mountains of Veracruz. We got there early enough to buy some cigars for friends and watched The Mummy in a local theater. The next day we made it to Poza Rica and once again visited the ruins of El Tajín. This time we stayed to see the famous voladores descend from their spinning poles in the parking lot in front. We wanted to make it to Austin the next day, but we couldn't. The car line at the border took until after sundown, so we stayed in Kingsville. But we did make it the next day. Jim got on a bus back to Kansas, and I got working on the report. By November, the field reports and the new maps were done and submitted to FAMC. So, that's it for Season 2 of the Palenque Mapping Project. I'm not sure when, but I'll tell the story of Season 3 in future episodes. Again, a 3-part series. Until next month, this is Ed, signing off. You've been listening to ArchaeoEd, a podcast about the ancient civilizations of the Americas. If you like what you heard, please click like, subscribe, and tell your friends. If you didn't, don't do any of that stuff. ArchaeoEd is written, recorded, and produced by me, Ed Barnhart, and it's owned by my company, Ancient Explorations, LLC. ArchaeoEd is my intellectual property, all rights reserved. Copyright 2024.